I've been critical of Dark Souls 3 in the past. Not because it's bad, mind you, but because it's conventional. Suddenly burdened with the curse of having to do numbers and meeting sales expectations, Dark Souls 3, it plays it pretty safe. And you know what? Not a bad thing. DS3 is a fantastic action game with a solid difficulty curve, majestic vistas, and every other adjective to make a game's Metacritic summary cream. At over 10 million copies sold, Dark Souls 3 is the most successful Souls game, and it's not a surprise. The game gives you a sword. The game gives you a roll button. At the start of the game, hitting things with your sword and rolling away from people hitting you with their sword face, body, things is easy. As you get further in the game, doing the hitting and the dodging gets harder. DS3 plays a lot like a modern-day Punch-Out. The core gameplay loop is pattern recognition. See pattern, die, know pattern a bit better, rinse and repeat until win. The Souls mantra of get good has never been more apt. There's just fewer ways to break Dark Souls 3 than the previous games. The game is almost entirely a sequence of linear combat encounters that properly scale themselves. This is distinct from the older games in the series, Demon Souls and Dark Souls Classic, where it's less about get good and more about get smart, or, if we're being honest, more get good at looking it up on the wiki. While DS3 is a straight action game, the older games are just as much adventure games as they are action games. They're not exclusively about outmaneuvering enemies, but observing level layout, exploiting weaknesses, and abusing a variety of tools from melee weapons to magic and bows and environmental hazards. Now, what is the point in saying all this? Today, I want to argue against the common idea that the best bosses in the series are the stamina-eating monstrosities of Dark Souls 3, and instead the sometimes pathetic, part-time gauntlet, occasional set-piece bosses of Demon Souls. It's a common view that the bosses of Demon Souls are the worst in the series because of how easy they are. I say it's the reverse. Demon Souls is a game that challenges the idea of what a boss is and what a boss can be. As well, the bosses show how movesets, arenas, gimmicks, and music can be used in a variety of ways to build tone and story. Up to this point, and throughout the video, you might get the impression that I think Dark Souls 3 is bad. But I want to be clear that that's only because we'll be using DS3 as a barometer for standard. It's a superlative action game, but it's traditional both structurally and mechanically. Demon Souls is not normal. It's abnormal, a horribly tutorialized mess of a game with mechanics that are unexplained, underexplained, misexplained, untested, and actively harmful to the experience. It's an open-ended nightmare with one of the worst difficulty curves I've ever seen. It's a grindy, obtuse maelstrom of orphaned assets. Demon Souls is a fucked up game for sickos. Yet, despite the legendary difficulty and borderline unplayability to anyone but the most dedicated Souls head, one aspect of the game that is generally considered easy is the bosses. Later From Software joints like Dark Souls 3 and Sekiro Shadows Die Twice live and die off of their massive, horrifying, tough bosses, whereas Demon Souls rarely makes its bosses action centerpieces. Most of the time, the bosses in Demon Souls aren't challenges you overcome, but problems you solve. Despite its reputation of extreme difficulty, very few enemies in Demon Souls are combat threats on their own. Most enemies are either individually weak, are susceptible to backstabs and the player's faster movement, or can be trivialized with shields. What makes Demon Souls hard is a combination of the environments and enemy resistances. The limited enemy movesets become more problematic the longer fights go on for because that's more opportunity for the players to make mistakes. Let's look at the miners in Stonefang Tunnel. It's likely that damage output against these enemies is going to look like this at first for many players. Many of those players will do one of the following: A. Quit. B. Get good and fight on. C. Try something else. The intended method is to try something else. The game spells out to the player that thrusting damage and magic is good against these enemies in developer messages at the start of the level. Let's see what happens when I switch to a weapon like the pickaxe, which deals thrusting damage. How about blasting them with magic? By the same token, most of the difficulty escalation that happens in the game is environmental. not combat. With the major exception of the ritual path, most of Demon's Souls' difficulty is about how much floor you have. This of course works both ways, since the environments you have to work with are the same the enemies have to work with. And since the enemies are AI, they're pretty fucking stupid. With the central challenge of Demon's Souls being the exploitation of enemy weaknesses and the environment, it's natural that the bosses would mostly be what the fanbase has labeled gimmick fights. A fight that involves some sort of deception, trickery, or an abusable weakness is often considered a gimmick fight. Most of the bosses in Demon's Souls fit this description, and even the more standard combat checks usually have some kind of weakness to exploit. What makes the fights in Demon's Souls great is that they follow the game's central challenges of observation and experimentation. Before diving into specifics, I would like to rebut the common criticism that the Demon's Souls bosses are bad because once you know the tricks, they fall too easily. It is true that the Demon's Souls bosses succumb quickly to a player who knows how to goof on them, but I think that's perfectly fine, because getting to the point of abusing the bosses is more unique and engaging than getting to that same point with Dark Souls 3 or Bloodborne bosses. The overwhelming majority of these bosses are approached in the same way from one fight to the next, and the mechanical execution of dodge and punish becomes the process every fight goes through. Despite their relative ease, each boss in Demon's Souls requires a much more varied approach, where you have to study the boss's arena, design, and attacks to find weaknesses to exploit, not just attack windows to capitalize on. This is why I think it's important to view Demon's Souls as an adventure game primarily, rather than an action hack and slash. Believe me, there are problems with Demon's Souls and how it fails to teach and incentivize experimentation. But since pretending that Demon's Souls is a brilliant masterpiece is an important part of my existential value, I'll wait until later to cover those problems. For now, let's jump into the bosses. Meaty. The first real boss in the game is Phalanx. Phalanx himself is a squirming, defenseless blob that hides behind a horde of hoplites, a shielded enemy that regular weapons bounce right off of. If a player comes in and tries to get right in Phalanx's face and attack, the fight won't last long for the poor player. Instead, using the knowledge the player has acquired from the previous level, they will know that the hoplites are weak from behind. They will also have a large stockpile of turpentine and firebombs from the previous level. The hoplites are weak to fire, and the splash damage from firebombs will quickly thin their numbers. Using the pillars around the arena, the player can crowd control and use the cover to break hoplites away from the main group and to heal. These pillars are an offensive and defensive tool. If thought about as a mechanical challenge, Phalanx is a joke compared to Vort of the Boreal Valley, but when considered as a problem for an adventurer to solve, it's brilliant. The same process of identifying weaknesses applies to even the major combat bosses in Demon's Souls. Flame Lurker is considered by many to be the hardest boss in Demon's Souls. He's fast, aggressive, and gives few windows for healing. He also hits hard, or at least he's supposed to. Everyone likely gets trashed on their first trip to Flame Lurker. However, careful observation will reveal a couple of weaknesses. For one, he has no ranged attacks. Unlike Phalanx, whose hoplites would chuck spears, Flame Lurker has no ranged options, so creating space and smashing him with arrows and magic are ways to put damage on him that he really can't deal too well with. As far as magic goes, not just any magic will do. Fireball spells will be ineffective, while spells like Soul Arrow will do well. Getting up close to Flame Lurker will happen no matter what, so recognizing that he punches you with fists made out of fire is a sign that increasing your fire and physical defenses are good. Look at what happens to his damage output when you wrap yourself in a protection spell and Water Veil. If magic ain't your thing, watch as he fruitlessly hits himself against a purple flame shield, which blocks 100% physical damage and 90% fire damage. Flame Lurker is a nightmare the first time you encounter him, but careful observation reveals those weaknesses. The same goes for the Old Hero. Old Hero is a tough cookie, but he flails about wildly. The opening cinematic for the fight draws attention to his blinded eyes. His wild attacks are because he's using sound to find you, and if the player whips out the Thief Ring or a Cloak spell, your sounds are deafened and the Old Hero is stranded at sea. So far off course. I could continue like this, use the torches in the Dirty Colossus fight to burn off his swarming flies, take advantage of the high ground against the Leechmonger, use range to break Alant's AoE, but I think the picture's clear enough. Not every fight is like this. Some of the bosses are straight up set pieces, like Storm King, or require very specific actions, like the Dragon God. Not every fight in this game works, but they are fantastic at getting the player to engage with the game as an adventurer. I love this because it fills the world of Demon's Souls with a mystical quality. You never know what you're going to find, or how you'll have to deal with it. Those fog gates don't just hide big HP bars you need to smack up, but also fire pits, poison swamps, man-eating gargoyles, and horrible tragedies. This world is lived in, and the demons terrorizing the lands fit wonderfully within the levels they inhabit. Deceptive mystics in the haunted Tower of Latria, a king's knights in Boletaria Castle, and saints of mercy amongst the filth and forgotten poor. Sometimes the bosses of Bloodborne and Dark Souls 3 hit the same. The Twin Princes, Deacons of the Deep, Micolash, Father Gascoigne, these are all bosses that feel of their place. It makes sense to find the lost and powerful Nameless King tucked away in Arkdragon Peak, or to find the Witches of Hemwick practicing their mad incantations deep in the woods of Hemwick Charnel Lane. Every boss in Demon's Souls is like that, even if the execution of some of these concepts aren't as effective. There are, unfortunately, two major caveats to all of this. The first is that Demon's Souls absolutely fails at teaching the player to identify and exploit weaknesses. For one, only a handful of classes start off with either magic or a bow, meaning that many players aren't going to initially think to incorporate magic, miracles, or bows into their loadout, and besides, if the player doesn't start with ranged options, they don't get a tutorial on how to use bows or magic. As well, the opening tutorial only gives the player a hammer and, well, you know, everything starts to look like a nail. The differences between damage types and the damage reduction from armor and shields is information buried away in the frankly confusing UI. I mean, look at these symbols in the original game. Tell me what these mean just based off of the information you see on the screen right here. This makes experimenting difficult because your options are obscured by volume and ignorance. Or those options are limited by not having a floor. For example, if the player thinks fire is a boss's weakness and they use turpentine and then die, they don't get that turpentine back. To refresh your stocks, you need to either find more in the world, which good fucking luck, or buy them. And early on, these prices are criminal. I don't care if it's turpentine, poison kunais, or fire bombs. I have always been gun-shy toward using consumables in Souls because of the limited stock, and many players are going to be the same. To compound everything further, upgrading weapons in Demon's Souls is expensive and grindy. Everyone knows the terror of the pure blade stone in the original version, but the problem applies to all weapon types. Each upgrade level requires a multitude of different materials, and actually getting those materials can be difficult since crystal lizards can despawn before their innards are harvested, and drop rates can get comically low for the higher level materials. As if making upgrades wasn't a grind enough, there are also a bunch of different upgrade paths, and different weapons innately require different materials. Spiderstone, Bladestone, Dragonstone, Sharpstone, Moonshade Stone. It's convoluted, and the already tight squeeze on resources makes experimenting with different level appropriate weapon types unappealing. One of the brilliant moves in Dark Souls was to simplify this all down to mostly Titanite and Twinkling Titanite, with 2 and 3 being even better by making upgrade materials even more plentiful. So, despite the game expecting you to try out and utilize a variety of weapons from stabby ones to smashy ones, and to take pot shots with bows and parry and deny enemies with tower shields, the game doesn't really give the knowledge or the resources to properly mess around with all this different stuff, which can make the adventurous and experimental aspect of the bosses less impactful, since the game equips and trains you to approach most situations as combat encounters. The other caveat to Demon's Souls bosses and everything is 2020 remake specific. One of the brilliant aspects of the Demon's Souls bosses is the music. Boss themes were all over the place, experimenting with different textures and tones to further add to the flavor of the dying world of Boletaria. While I understand the shift in boss style in Dark Souls 3 to make the game a stronger action game, I don't like the decision to make most of the boss music similar. Almost every song is composed of a choir, deep strings, and booming brass. There are great musical ideas here, like tying the Twin Princes and Nameless King together with harpsichord sections, but most of the songs regress towards the mean. It's impossible to not get hyped up by Vort's theme or feel the weight of the collapsing world during Soul of Cinder, but the music all has such a similar texture. Even the slow jams of Dancer and Sister Freed ultimately circle and underline the same textures as the rest of the boss songs. Demon's Souls Remake does the same. It throws away most of the original score in favor of songs that evoke similar moods to DS3. Let's listen to some comparisons. Here's the original Maiden Astraea theme. Here's the remake. Flame Lurker. Here's the remake. And while not a boss, let's compare the Maiden in Black theme. Here's the remake. All of this music is good on its own, and works, but the original score evokes many different moods by varying not just the tempo, but also the texture, and it plays with juxtaposition and silence much more. So not only does the game not do a very good job at teaching the player to adopt the more adventure game mindset, the music of the remake further pushes players to approach and understand the bosses in the same way as Dark Souls 3 bosses, which is just not right for the gameplay these bosses are going for. Looking back at everything we've seen here, I get the impression that Demon's Souls bosses are very similar to the game at large. They're a mess, full of brilliant ideas that are trapped in the mud of Demon's Souls' wild abandon. Had this game been built with better cohesion, perhaps the brilliance of its bosses wouldn't have been so lost for so long. Depending on your perspective, Demon's Souls is either a great misfire or a flawed masterpiece, with its bosses serving as ground zero for its brilliance and its failures.
You covetous ones, let it be known, we shall defend our hearth and home to the death